Welcome to the fifth video in the series, The Human Movement Method, Evolutionary Biomechanics, a new way of viewing lifelong fitness, health, and wellness. Our goal in this video is to explain the core concepts, movements, and programming principles behind the human movement method at its foundation. This is the beginning of the conversation, definitely not the end. And my goal is to share this with people so that they can find better ways to train or better ways to train their clients that's going to translate to better health, well-being, and frankly, significantly better loci of movement throughout life by practicing vital and important skills that are not only going to help with muscle development and neurological development and cardiovascular endurance, but also be restorative to the body and limit compression and shearing force. So first we're going to talk about the core concepts of the program. If you've watched the 4 videos previous to this one, the philosophical foundation has been thoroughly laid. We talked about how thermodynamics and evolution operate together and how that ultimately formed human beings. And why there are core movements that are evolutionarily incentivized in our structure and in our bodies. In the second one, we talked about how the fitness industry came to be what it is today and about where it's moving forward and what the benefits and drawbacks of that are. In the third, we talked about the basic principles of programming that most every personal trainer or advanced athlete knows. And then in the fourth, we talked about the 5 lenses through which we are viewing this. And now we're going to talk about how we're going to put all of that together and produce a different way of viewing training and a different way of effectively training so that we're creating what I would refer to as a stable operating platform so that way we can just attach skills as needed. And then, sports-specific training or activity-specific training or corrective-specific training can be done as the 20% on the side of this being the 80% of the majority of the work. So at the core concepts, we're looking at the ABCs of training, 3-dimensional training, interdependence. We've kind of talked about these different components. We really want to maximize recruitment. We want to emphasize joint control. We really want to work to control time under tension for metabolic stimulus. We want to definitely apply the concepts of progressive overload. We want to train our movements, not muscles. We want to train gait dynamics in as many movements as we possibly can, or posture dynamics. We want to work up and down the kinetic chain or the mechanical chain, and we're going to talk a lot about that. This is how we find issues either in posture or movement, and we go in and address those issues. And that's by going through a really simple process of releasing it, mobilizing it, and activating it. And there's a secret 4th step, which is reintegration. And then we're going to go through the 4-phase training model, and we're going to talk about how you structure training from a daily basis all the way up to a macro cycle level. So first, let's talk about the ABCs of training. The A's are alignment, accuracy, and awareness. The B is balance, and the C's are coordination and control. Now, that might seem a little bit redundant because in order to coordinate your body, you have to control it. But we'll talk about why I listed those separately. So alignment, understanding the geometry of movement for effective biomechanics, bringing one's own physical, mental, and emotional states into balance to efficiently act. This is really, really important. So not only are we physically aligned in 3-dimensional space, but we are also mentally, emotionally, and physically aligned in space and time. That's very, very important to maintaining balance in one's own training. Having knowledge of each technique's form, function, and principles, and effectively executing the techniques. So making sure that we are not imitating, but that we are accurately performing each movement, and we understand what each piece does and why it does what it does. Awareness, accurately and effectively gauging one's own physical and mental emotional states before, during, and after training. This includes understanding where a person is in space and time. So we can't have alignment or accuracy without awareness. Awareness is absolutely vital to all these other functions. So you can't just show up to a workout and rep it out and just get it done. That's not how this works. You need to be conscious and present in every moment because it requires your focus to effectively achieve these things. So next we're talking about balance. Effectively managing one's own relative body in space. That's one form of balance. As well as making effective use of release, mobilization, and activation techniques to maintain postural and mechanical balance. And managing stimulus and recovery. So that's now managing the balance of how much exercise are we doing versus how much are we recovering, and making sure that we're moving in the right direction. Every one of those is its own form of balance that we need to focus on in our training. Coordination, managing one's own body with effective timing and control throughout a movement, bringing together all aspects of training in balance and alignment. So this means that you take everything that's listed above coordination, and when you do all of that together, you have coordination. Congratulations. And then lastly, control. Managing the complex nature of multi-joint, three-dimensional movement effectively in accordance with effective training principles. So again, these are a list, but if you look at them closely, they're also a pyramid. At the very base of this, we need to understand that alignment, that accuracy, and that awareness. We need to make sure that we maintain proper balance. And if we are able to do all of that with good coordination, we effectively are controlling ourselves in space. So 3D training. What do we mean by 3D training? Each technique should move through all planes of motion simultaneously, typically with one plane emphasized over the others being secondary. So this means, and you see this a lot in traditional lifting, except it's the front, back, anterior, posterior relationship that's really, really emphasized, where we want to put a balance into that where it's only 1/3 of the equation. So we will categorize these movements in training as anterior, posterior, front, back, lateral, medial, side to side, and rotational, meaning twisting around the axis. But this also means that rotation applies not only to the spine and the core, but also to the shoulders and the hips, and how the limbs move through space. They should be rotating as well because that is natural to human beings. Next, we want to look at joint control. Understanding and effectively managing each joint's optimal range of motion and position through the course of an exercise and movement. So joint control and mobility go hand in hand. To have mobility means being able to control one's joint in space. To have flexibility means to be able to passively load a joint to its maximum end range of motion. We are choosing mobility and joint control over flexibility because mobility is what's going to allow us to control our joints in space to minimize risk of shear and compression, as well as making sure that we're effectively training for whole body movement through three-dimensional space. And that's where we get into interdependence. Once we establish and understand independent joint control, then we can use awareness and coordination to effectively control balance and alignment interdependently. So we talked about this in the fourth video quite a bit, and this is the same images, because it's all about how there's a three-dimensional axis at each one of these areas of the body, and they all need to be in relatively good alignment. And that doesn't mean my knee's in the right place and everything else is out of place. It means that my foot stacks the right way to support my ankle stacks the right way to support my knee, my hip supports the right way, stacks the right way to support my knee, my pelvis is in an appropriate position to support my hip and spine, and so on. Understanding this and how it can be affected through myofascial mobilization, myofascial release, mobilization, and effective strength training or activation is key in developing good lifelong habits for health and wellness. So we also want to focus on recruitment. If we move through three-dimensional space, controlling each joint at their interdependent relationships, balance will be challenged, meaning you're going to see when we get to the geometry of movement study that we're going to be moving through 3 dimensions simultaneously, and we still need to maintain proper alignment. As a result, the body will react with a higher degree of muscle fiber recruitment to deal with the challenging dynamics of the load. As a result, higher neurological, muscular, and metabolic function will occur with less compression and shearing force on joints. And so to say that in plain English, basically we build more muscle, better skills, and more efficiency with less wear and tear on the body using less weight and higher leverage in natural movements. And you'll see how that's expressed in the geometry of movement. Basically, what you're seeing on the right here is one way that you could accomplish recruitment. Although I don't know how safe and practical and effective it is lifelong, we're going to go for something a little bit more practical. So next, we also want to control time under tension. Taking all of the factors already discussed into account, we now can control tempo, timing, and maximize time under tension. So where you'll see a lot of people on the internet doing similar movements to what I'm suggesting, they're loading and doing explosive force because it's translating to athletic-based movement. Well, if done correctly, that's great. But as we age, that may not be what's best for our bodies. And recent studies have shown that our tissue adapts to its end range of motion maximal load point. So it's not necessarily the repetitive use of the joint, but that we can maximally load or load our end range of motion properly is going to cause adaptation to the fascia. Basically, what we're trying to do is generate a slow, smooth, consistent movement throughout a single repetition and then maintain that tempo throughout the set. If this can be accomplished, if this can't be accomplished, we've reached technical failure. So when we go back to the ABCs, we're looking for the point at which the ability to control oneself in three-dimensional space under appropriate tension starts to fall apart. That tells us we're at technical failure, we've reached fatigue, and that way we don't need to go into total failure. We don't need to work to the point where the joints could potentially be at risk and the tonic muscles are likely going to become overactive. We instead want to work to technical failure and then rest from that point and continuously overload the muscle fibers in that manner so that we're building in good mechanics. So next we want to look at progressive overload. So there's lots of different factors to control for progressive overload. So for example, resistance is the one that everybody kind of goes to. I can always increase my weight. Well, that's true until you hit the point of technical failure. And then you may want to practice at that weight for a while, focusing on things like tempo, the speed and pace at which the action is performed, affecting the time under tension, volume, the total amount of weight lifted during a workout. This is done by calculating weight times resistance. So how much weight, sorry. Oh, God damn it. So volume is calculated by the amount of weight times its reps. So how much weight am I lifting for how many reps, then multiplying that by how many sets over the amount of time. That's what equals volume. So the factors in that equation are, I can increase or decrease my weight. I can increase or decrease my reps. I can increase or decrease my sets. And I can increase or decrease the time. That's going to ultimately equal the total volume of a workout. So let's say I keep the weight the same, I reduce my rests, and I increase the number of sets, but I do it all in the same amount of time. I've effectively increased the resistance over time. That's one way to affect progressive overload. It's also known as workload. Rest periods, effectively managing rest periods is is really important, if not more important than managing work periods, especially if you or your client have specific health concerns. So if a person's dealing with chronic fatigue or long COVID, or they're a person that has, for example, a collagen disorder. These are all things they may need more rest than the average person so that they can effectively perform the number of repetitions required. Heart rate. Knowing what the physical signs of each heart rate zone look like, you can manage yourself and your clients based on the goal zone. Most of the time, we want to be sitting around zone 2. We can bridge into zone 3 and 4, and occasionally we want to stimulate zone 5 to produce lactic acid so that way we're utilizing it as a precursor for HGH production, which will help with muscle growth. But what's really important to understand is if we're bridging into zone 3, 4, and 5, and we're training up at that level really hard all of the time, our recovery is going to suffer. So we need to kind of have a mental understanding of where the appropriate heart rate zones are and how to train for them. And then last, we want to have support exercises. So support exercises are more isolated exercises intended to increase brain-body connection to the muscle or micro movement to build more strength, resistance, coordination, and control to be integrated back into the core movement. These are administered on an individual basis for each specific client or need. That's a really long way of saying when we watch the core movements, if we see a problem area, we need to assign that client or assign ourselves a series of release, mobilization, and activation exercises to then retrain that area of the motor movement and reincorporate it into the larger whole. So, training movements, not muscles. Training movements in this system will be broken into the following core movement dynamics, which we will either directly train or mimic in our training. So that is standing, walking, jogging, running, throwing, climbing, crawling, carrying, pushing, or pulling. These are the evolutionarily incentivized movements for humans. So we want to really focus on making sure our dynamics are driven primarily from the 5 lenses that we talked about and in the direction of mimicking these types of motions. This video is to explain and help explore human gait dynamics and how they are incorporated into our training in the human movement method when we're looking at this evolutionary biomechanics. So gait dynamics. We're going to primarily cover walking. I'll get into jogging and running at some other time, but for now we're going to talk about walking. So when we're talking about walking, there are basically 2 phases of a stride that we need to look at. And we're going to talk a little bit about both of them. The first phase is what's known as the stance phase. So I walk and place my foot on the ground. This leg is now a stabilizer. And what's going to happen is the other leg is going to move through. So right now, this leg is the stance leg, meaning it's providing all of the structural stability. The other leg is called the swing leg, meaning that it's going to be swinging like a pendulum, like so. So the stance leg carries my body through space, and the swing leg catches me on the next step. That's a really simple way of explaining it. So if we look at basic gait pattern, what we're going to see is a person that takes a step. I'm going to take my first step. Now, stance leg. You'll notice my swing leg right now, stance leg, knee is going over the foot. I am going to now rock through this leg as this leg swings through. As I project off the back foot by engaging my glute and pushing down through the ball of my foot, there's going to be a slight internal rotation to load my weight onto the stance leg. Then the swing begins. As the swing follows through, there's going to be the toe off, extension of the hip, ball of the foot driving into the ground, catching myself here. This is what the legs do in motion. So I'm going to step, step. Now as the leg swings through, it's going to swing and slightly externally rotate, but when it touches down, so there's that slight external rotation, but when it touches down, it straightens. And then toeing off in the back, slight external rotation, touches down. Now, if we're talking about spinal engine mechanics, we know that the body produces this walking motion from the spine outward. So I could technically generate a reasonable gait without bending my knees or using my feet, for example. So I don't need to push myself through space. My body carries me through space, through side bending, rotation, and all the dynamics that we've talked about and looked at with the spinal engine model. What's important to understand is that I am not generating propulsion through my feet. My feet are carrying me over space, and the propulsion is being generated by the movement of my entire body. And if I'm doing it properly, my joints are going to be stable, but free floating, and they're going to be aligned in a way where I'm able to successfully create these dynamics without either moving from my hips or creating what we would like to call sagittitis, where the body is overly tight and only moved by the limbs. So I look kind of like a Tin Man marching. That's stable core. And then, of course, you have, back when I was powerlifting, the waddle, which is where you're not comfortable and your spine isn't working right and your knees aren't working right. So what happens is you rely on a side bend to kind of lift the leg and move it. But instead of doing that from the spine, you wind up doing it with a really tight core by kind of moving from the pelvis, which actually really irritates the back. So to see this from the side, what's important to understand is that the stance leg is a pendulum from the bottom up, meaning the ankle's like half a ball joint, and obviously the hip is a ball joint. So once this leg sets, the pendulum starts here, and the arc happens here through the transfer. But then when I'm in the swing phase, the fulcrum's here, and the pendulum swings this way. So the stance leg is a pendulum from here up, and the swing leg is a pendulum from here down. Now, in order to fully understand this, well, the other piece that you need to understand is that there's one crazy little thing that our body does, and that is it hikes the hip. So I go into stance phase, internal rotation here. When I go to transfer into the swing phase for this leg shouldn't drop this hip. It should slightly raise, about 5 degrees. I'm overdoing it. So if you watch the spinal engine videos of the gentleman with no arms or legs, you see he contracts the obliques to create that tilt so that he can create that motion. Let's see if I can do it backward. This way. So it's not me raising my knee, kicking my foot out, and falling. I once heard someone say that walking is controlled falling. That is by far and away one of the most ignorant statements that has ever been uttered. The reality is walking is a propulsion system that moves from the spine outward, that combines anterior, posterior flexion and extension, rotation, and side flexion in order to create a three-dimensional model. And it is present in everything that we do. And it is at the core of most evolution, which we've gone over in many of the videos. So the key to understand here is that when we're looking at our split stance or we're looking at our square stance, the split stance is designed to create dynamics similar to gait function and really, really, really stress the importance of stability of the stance leg and rotation and control of the pelvis, because the pelvis is functionally a gyrotable for the spine. So if you're looking at it from the idea that it supports the spine, it is also, because of the way the core is structured and the way all the ligaments and muscles come together, it is part of the drive system because it's driving forward. I don't even need to take a step. I can hip raise and propel that way. This leg can stay totally straight. And I can still make it happen because it's about that side flexion, rotation, and anterior, posterior flexion and extension that creates that drive function. So you'll often see if people have neurological damage or they've suffered from strokes, what will often happen is they really work hard to make sure that they can pick up their foot. And it's because if you can't pick up your foot, you'll catch your toe on the ground, and this becomes a falling hazard. So it's important to understand that that ability to propel through the foot helps the other leg clear. But if that can't be done for some reason, it's not just coming from the feet, it's also coming from the hips. And we also know that when there's neurological damage to the leg, it goes into extension. And so when it goes into extension, again, that toe becomes an issue. But if for some reason I couldn't get medical help, the leg was damaged and it went into extension, the toe pressing into the ground creates that shock absorber, and then I can still use the leg as needed. It can still swing and be a stance leg because it's not propelling. So it is reasonable to assume that even with a limp and nerve damage, that reasonable biomechanics can be achieved in a reasonable way with some degree of symmetry, as long as we understand why the mechanics exist and why the body does that from a protective standpoint. So ultimately, the point of this entire thing is understanding that three different things are really happening. We've got the stance leg that's carrying us from the bottom up, but not necessarily propelling us. We have the swing leg that's transferring weight and preparing for the next phase of the motion. And we also have this really important spinal engine function that we definitely see around the core through this side flexion that gives us, as I hike, I not only get drive, but I also get the ability to clear the ground with the other leg. So it's really key to understand that this action is as much a part of the propulsion system of walking as anything the feet or legs are doing. I'm not bounding through space by catching myself and jumping to the next leg. It's not how it works. I am propelling myself through space through a series of rotations that generate linear movement. So I'll just show that real quick. It's rotation, 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 rotation. Internal, external, internal, external, internal, external, internal, external, internal, external, internal, external, and then you put all that together and you get flexion of the spine. I know this is ridiculous looking, but it's an illustration of how the human body takes rotation inflection of the spine and creates linear movement. All right, so this video is in regards to, hold on. 3, 2, 1. All right, this video is in regards to the split stance. So throughout the process that we're talking about, this human movement method, the split stance plays a really important role in making sure that we are utilizing the accuracy and awareness as well as the balance and control portions of the ABCs that we're looking at. The accuracy and awareness component comes from balance. That's the B. So if we look at human balance, when I'm standing with my feet side by side, I am really strong laterally, side to side. Laterally and medially, if you push on my shoulder here, I'm really, really stable. The best way of experiencing this on your own, if you want to try this as an experiment, would be go to a wall, stand sideways to the wall, and push with your arm into the wall and resist. If you can push into the wall and resist, push into the wall and resist, what you're going to find is that you're stable. But then if I turn and go this way, what you're going to find is that if I have my feet square and I try to push into the wall with both hands, there is no way that I am going to be able to maintain my balance. So in this direction, I'm balanced. I have great stability. In this direction, if my feet stay side by side, even if I bend my knees a lot, I'm going to push myself off the wall. And it's because if you draw a line in the direction of the feet here and then draw another line through it, that's going to be the weak point in a person. Now, that being said, if I get into a split stance, which in our case here, when we're talking about the split stance, we're talking about taking a normal strided step, and then from here, flexing the knee, the front knee, getting on the ball of the back foot, actively projecting force through the ball of that back foot. And now I want a distribution of 80% of my weight's on the front, 20% of my weight's on the back. My hips are square, and I've got the ability to flex. From here, if I go up to the wall and I push forward, like so, I'm stable. Now, what's interesting is that if I get into that split stance and I have the line that we talked about, now I'm unstable side to side. So if I get into the split stance here and push, I have no balance. So the reason that this is important is that many of the exercises that you'll do are either going to be in what I call a square stance or a split stance. And many of these two stances relate heavily to either posture or gait. So it's important to understand that part of what we're doing is we're training, utilizing static positions to simulate dynamic positions. And in each movement, for example, the split lunge, I am not only going to be moving up and down like you would see traditionally in training, but I am also going to be rotating at the same time. And I am also going to, at the highest level, have a slight side bend. Slight side bend. And we'll talk about columns of support and the geometry of movement in regards to this, but the important thing to understand when it comes to the split stance and the square stance is that both of them have advantages and disadvantages. One is not better than the other necessarily, but we need to understand their dynamics in order to effectively apply them to training either for ourselves or for our clients. So now we want to talk about loading. Bilateral, unilateral, ipsilateral, and contralateral. Unilateral, often used for corrective exercises. This is where we would train one limb at a time. This can be really useful for isolating mechanics when bilaterally things are not similar. Bilateral lifts are most of what you see at the gym. Some sort of two-armed bench press or two-armed pull down or seated row or a squat or a deadlift. These are all bilateral lifts. A barbell curl, bilateral lift. Most people, most of the time, are doing bilateral lifts in the traditional sense, at least in the modern traditional sense. In the golden age of physical culture, like the early strongman culture, single limb lifts were really, really common. So ipsilateral, this is outside loads relative to the stance. You can see, it's interesting because they don't include the core in these images, but the core is definitely a part of it. So from the perspective of like myofascial slings, ipsilateral loading is all about affecting either the superficial anterior posterior single side or the lateral line on that side. When we get into contralateral lifts, we're getting more into the anterior posterior oblique slings, the arm lines, and we're also getting into the spiral line a lot more. So it's important to understand that we're going to be mostly working in the unilateral, ipsilateral, and contralateral areas. And when we do bilaterally load, the relationship will not be identical, and the tool will most likely be 2 dumbbells or 2 kettlebells and not a barbell. A barbell creates artificial stability so that way you can achieve a higher load. We aren't looking for that. We are looking for a high degree of interdependence and a high degree of instability so that way we can focus on controlling that weight and those movements through space. So now we're going to talk about the geometry of movement. This is a term that was inspired by Sergei Grekovetsky's The Spinal Engine, where he talks about the relative relationship of lateral flexion in the flat critter dynamics. We went over this in the 5-part lens video, but I'm going to now show with each core movement examples of the geometry of movement where we are looking for lines of force and lines of coordination and lines of balance that are biomechanically correct. So this is a study of linear dynamics and effects of this model on each part of the body in space, working together in proper relative positioning, distancing, and timing to effectively and safely practice each technique globally. That is a really complicated way of saying everything's in the right place at the right time and you're not putting yourself in danger. So first we're going to look at the split lunge. You'll notice that anytime we're in a split stance, as we talked about in the video, the 80-20 weight distribution rule pretty much applies. And you're going to see through these lines that I've drawn on these images where the balance and load is focused. So the rear foot on the ball of the big toe pushing down actively, if you're doing that consistently, it pushes you over your front foot. Feet hip width apart. So that's hip width apart, not shoulder width apart, which is really important. You want to make sure that the front and back knee is tracking over the toe. You want to make sure that the hips remain relatively level. When it says relatively level, our tolerance for that is 5 degrees of tilt, which is also our tolerance for it in gait dynamics. Reasonable core rotation, or reasonable rotation of the core. What that means is I'm not trying to whip through my spine, but I am allowing myself to rotate and side bend, which you see there in those 2 points, also reasonable side flexion, to make sure that I am maintaining proper head over foot dynamics and that everything is staying in appropriate alignment. So I am not in a static position. Internal rotation of the inside hand, external rotation of the outside hand, and your head should stay relatively level within tolerance. If you look down here at this video where my head is slightly tilted, that's super common. This is an area where there's going to be adjustments based on each person and what their neck will tolerate. So let's go ahead and look at the first video. This is a split lunge with the outside load. First, you're going to see that the balance line here, I am focused posturally over my foot, and that the load is on my shoulder, and my shoulder stays mainly over that ankle the whole time. Now you're going to see that there is a relative similarity between the angle of my shin and the angle of my back while maintaining that load, and that this creates, these triangles are going to show up a lot, this kind of triangular structure. Here we're going to be looking at where the center of force is in the movement. So you'll see that in this case it focuses right on the center of the pelvis, and that as I drop, that same point of focus goes over the loaded arm at the shoulder, at the top. You can see how that, relatively speaking, is similar. So this is a split lunge with the inside load, so that means the dumbbell is in my inside hand. Here you're going to see that my head is relatively positioned over my front foot, and that the weight, as it moves up and down, is actually only slightly moving from side to side around that second line. Here you're going to see the head over foot position in the lower position, and you're going to see how the cross section here when I stand up is going to align right on that hip. So the pivot point that the body's essentially moving around is that hip right now. And when we look at the contralateral relationship from the center line, you're going to see that the weight is shifting down into that center line, and my head is still contralaterally relative to its opposing foot. Now we're going to look at a split RDL. So many of these things remain the same. The key here is that the hip drives backwards in a hinge movement, and the hip remains relatively level. Again, 5 degrees of tilt is fine. But the spine is going to stay relatively straight, and the head stays level within tolerance in this case, meaning I imagine that I'm always looking forward. So I'm not looking up at the horizon. As my body hinges and my chest points down, my eyes point down with it. You'll see that here. So here we're starting with the inside load. This is the contralateral load. You're going to see there's that column of support, which is shifted a bit. And you'll see as my hip drives back and my chest comes forward, we still see that the weight is moving around that line. In the contralateral relationship here, you can see my head is still shifted to the side, and that the dynamics, even though it's a different movement, the relative dynamics remain the same. So they really don't change. So now here the triangle is a triangle of positioning over that foot, and you can see that it's about the relationship between my hip, shoulder, and point of load. Here we're going to see those reoccurring 2 triangles again, focusing on the hip as the center of movement, and that my core center lines up with that position. I'm also not setting the weight on the ground. I'm just getting as close to the ground or tapping it, but not unloading. Now we're going to look at the outside load. So instead of the thumb rotating backward like it does on the inside load, the column of support now is ipsilaterally on one side. That weight is just going to drag down my leg as my hips hinge back. And I'm still going to rotate by reaching across my body to touch my toe. But my head stays over my foot, just like in the top video. And you can even see that the contralateral relationship is being maintained at that angle. You can see again the triangular relationship here, and that it's focused over that hip, and how the hips play a role in the triangular relationship. Next, we're going to look at the lateral lunge. So now we're in a wide square stance. So this is side by side because we're moving laterally medially. One leg is going to stay straight with the foot flat on the ground at all times. If you are trying to transition through different ranges of motion, like you want to sit down on the ground, your toe would turn up. We're not doing that in this case. We want the foot flat because we want maximal activation in the adductors and gluteus medius. Knees should track over toes of the bending knee. Hip drives back as the knee breaks forward. Reasonable rotation of core, which is limited in this case. Limited side flexion of the spine. Again, because we're moving laterally medially, you're not going to see as much of that. A relatively static position of the outside hand. You'll see what I mean by that. And the head stays relatively level within tolerance, meaning I'm not leaning my head one way or the other. So this is outside load. When we see outside load, I'm holding a kettlebell in the rack position. You would also essentially hold a dumbbell in the identical position. You can see here in the bottom point how the shoulder stays relatively over the ankle the entire time. Here you can see the triangular relationship between the head, spine, knee, and hip, and how we're producing structural stability that way. You can also see that at maximum range of motion, my hip is dropping below my knee. Here, very similar triangular relationship, allowing both hips to break back. You can also see that my lumbar is not completely flat, but it's also not moving much through space. It's maintaining a neutral position. Now, if we look at the inside load, what you're going to see is that the contralateral relationship here follows the hip-ankle relationship very closely, and that shoulder stays on that line the whole time. Here, there's a solid column of support with the center being right around where the knee is. So the knee now becomes essentially the pivot point that we're moving around. You can see how the arm is dropping in and the thumb is turning backward, but we're maintaining all of these strong lines of support consistently. We're not throwing the weight, but we are controlling its momentum. And we're using the rotation of the arm. You see this in lots of inside-outside load dynamics. And you can see shoulders stay level. The head is even moving, relatively speaking, to the same level that the shoulders are at. All of this is relative. So if one thing's out of place, you can see with the way these lines are drawn, everything would be out of place. So it has to all be in the right place at the right time, and there are lines of geometry that determine that. So now we're going to look at the curtsy lunge. Square stance, but in this case we are still doing an 80-20 weight distribution, which means that the leg that is the leg that I'm bending, that's supporting most of the load, I'm really going to put 80% of my weight on and try to keep my head centered over that foot and knee. The rear knee passes just behind the front calf. You're not stepping way back. The head stays over the foot the entire time. That's really important that you're not leaning way forward. Hip remains relatively level, but again, can shift up to 5 degrees, and all the other components are relatively the same. So if we look at it here from the side view, you see there's that column of support that I stay over the entire time. Shoulder, head, and body stay relatively over that foot. Here we see those triangles show back up for structural support. You can see that they focus on the ankle, hip, and knee. Here we see that diamond relationship again. You can see how my heel is actually tucking just behind my foot that's in the front there. Again, triangular relationship and relative movement. You can see how the legs have a triangular relationship in this case with the upper body. Now from the front view, I believe this is the inside load, you're going to see there's that column of support. My head is already over that foot. That's that 80-20 split. The weight is going to drop right into that space. And again, for the backhand, the hip is what's determining the position. For the front hip, it's the knee that determines the position. The hip is actually going to move to the side. We're trying to focus on the lower leg, which is ankle, shin, and knee, being in line with essentially the head. And we're still moving along this contralateral relationship line as best we can. So the path is determined proportionally to the body. So now we're going to look at a curl and press. The curl and press here is a split stance. You have to understand, as this gets heavier and heavier, it's the opposite of an isolation movement. There is lateral flexion that's involved, there's rotation that's involved, and we're keeping the weight fairly close to the body because we want rotation at the scapula and shoulder. We're not trying to remove rotation, we're trying to utilize it for its best practice, which is protraction and retraction of the scapula, kind of mimicking either lifting, throwing, or this is the opposite of descending, but it's mimicking the natural mechanics of descending, where if we were to descend a ladder or descend out of a tree, we tend to reach up and side flex as we do that. So all the dynamics remain essentially the same. The thing that we really need to focus on is the arm staying close to the body in a kind of zipping up motion. The press can be neutral, meaning thumb backward, or it can be full rotation where the palm is forward. The shoulder moves forward on the curl but retracts at the top or the rack position, and then stays back as you press and should retract as you press. So if you watch this closely, what you'll see here is that my weight is centered over the front foot. I have the dumbbell in my back hand. I bring it up close, and I'm maintaining focus over that front foot because as I reach up, I am side bending into the opposite side, basically lengthening the back foot side and shortening the front foot side. The contralateral relationship here remains similar, and my hand stays inside that stable relationship between basically where the center line is and where the other shoulder is. Now, seeing this from the side, those triangles reappear. There's not a lot of shifting. You can also see that my pelvis is tucked and my glutes are tight, and I'm trying to maintain this column the whole time, so that way, even though it's a contralateral relationship between the stabilizing leg and the pressing arm, we're still trying to maintain that vertical column of support. So the first movement in our vectored resistance training is going to be the split stance pull. So we're back to a split stance, 80-20 weight distribution. Now in this case, because the weight is pulling you forward, most of the weight is going to be on your front foot. You can't help it because the weight is pulling you forward. All the concepts remain the same, but the way it plays out in space is a little bit different. A lot of people have associated this to starting a lawnmower. But what I want to look at here is this contralateral relationship between hips and shoulders, and showing how the body, again, even the position of my back is relative to that contralateral relationship to the opposing foot, hip, shoulder. So the point that we're really rotating around here is actually the front hip. That is the point of rotation. I also want to make sure that as I'm pulling my shoulder blade back and down. And since this is an upward pull, you're going to see a straightening of the leg. That's not true if it's a downward pull necessarily, because each one of these is going to be a different vector at a different time. You can see here that there's still a column of support even at that angle, but that the relationships all remain the same as the axially loading techniques. So now we're going to look at the split stance press. So the 80-20 weight distribution in this case is actually 80% on the rear foot. The key here is that my knee is basically pointing down. My rear glute is flexed so that my hip stays in extension. I want to make sure that I've got a neutral position from my knee to my hip and that my body's actually moving around that place, because the ball of the back foot is providing an enormous amount of support here. And again, this is a low anchor, so I'm going to be pushing high, kind of like an overhead press. And you can see in the contralateral relationship, even at this angle, my hips are essentially the center. And you can see here how at full extension, there's a straight line from my heel all the way to the hand, and our triangle is back, and the little triangle all the way down there at the ankle. Contralateral relationship. Here you can really see the side bend and see that my head is still moving inside the contralateral relationship. And if we look at it from a quadrant perspective, I'm shifting over one foot, then over to the other foot. From here, we're looking at what the shoulder's doing. And believe it or not, the one piece that's really not moving in this case in the upper body is the opposing shoulder. It's kind of what's staying in place. So, and here you can see that within tolerance, I'm staying inside all of the appropriate. Now understand that you can go outside these lines, just like we discussed in the fourth video. You can go outside these tolerances, but chances are you're going to start increasing compression and shear forces if you go outside these tolerances. And again, you want to either check in with yourself or your client to find out what their experience is, because everybody's tolerance may be different, and our goal is ultimately going to be to increase tolerance. That's ultimately the goal, but we still need to stay inside the appropriate geometry of movement. But because it's a relative geometry, we can make adjustments for different body types and different issues as long as we are sticking to the core principles of the mechanics, which is this relative positioning, which is why I wanted to show these all in a row, because you see inside each movement, even though each movement is different, there are principles that guide each movement. So now we're going to look at the wood chop. This is a square stance. Now this one's a downward wood chop. When it's upward and when it's totally lateral medial, both feet tend to rotate on the ball of the foot, but when it's downward, only one foot tends to rotate on the ball of the foot. But you're going to see here that everything has to move together. My spine is very much involved, but you see all joints are rotating. My hips are rotating, my feet, my rear foot is rotating, but you can see that I'm inside this frame, so my stance is only as wide as my hand goes. From a contralateral relationship, the cable is following the relationship between my shoulder and hip. I'm trying to keep my arms as straight as possible with as little bend as possible. But you can see here I put the line right on the cable, how that runs relative to, for example, my thigh position. Here we're looking at more of a quadrant view, and you can see again the hips stay relatively in the same place in space, even though everything is rotating. So here we're looking at split stance downward rotation. So it's important to understand that in this, my arms are not what's moving the cable. My arms are actually in a fixed state. It is my core that is moving the cable. A combination of my rectus abdominis, obliques, and QL are working together to create this downward pull with rotation. So the arms stay straight, 80% of the weight's over the front foot. You see I'm inside this relative column of support. My head stays over my foot. I'm not leaning really far forward. I'm also not arching into my back. I'm hinging from my hips and using my rectus abdominis with my pelvis tucked to press down through the cable. And you can see that the position of my spine is even relative to the position of the cable in its end range of motion. Right there. You see it? Same thing here. Slightly different position, But you can see here how in rotation, the back winds up flat and the center of movement is around the core. And again, those triangles show up and the circle's there to emphasize that center is around the core, where the movement is being generated from, which is the core. Now we're going to look at split stance upward rotation. This is essentially what I call a bailing motion, like you're bailing something over your shoulder, like baling hay or throwing logs, maybe a giant cheesecloth full of apples. I don't know, something like that. So reverse twist. Here, my thumbs are pointed up. I've got the position of my foundation. I am pulling up and externally rotating the lower hand and internally rotating the upper hand. This also applies to a lot of martial arts movements. Not directly, but you can see where this can apply to throwing dynamics. This one and the one before it can very much be applied to throwing from stand-up game in martial arts and grappling. Again, all the same relationships. It's just, I'm showing these over and over and over again, one, so that you can be familiar with the movement, but also so that you can see that the relationships don't change. So here we're going to be doing a straight arm pull down. There's side flexion involved in this. Again, we're at an 80-20 split of weight distribution. The key is that the arm stays straight, the shoulder retracts, the head stays relatively level, and that when we pull down, we're pulling down to the position of the hip, which you'll see here. You can see how I'm always over my foundation. Everything above my feet is over my feet. My feet determine the foundation. Here's our triangle. With side flexion, you can see that even though there's side flexion, there's still these relative positions that I stay within. My head stays over my hips. My whole body stays over my feet. There is a strong column of support that runs from hip to opposing shoulder. You can see that the distance of my feet apart still produces structural stability. And I'm definitely on the ball of my back foot. So this one breaks all the rules. It's a face pull. I have a split stance single-handed version of this. I'm just not showing it here. It's a little bit more advanced for people. But most face pulls are actually done at eye level or higher. I prefer an upward facing face pull for a variety of reasons. There's lots of people that say that's bad for your shoulder. If you find that this aggravates your shoulders, try an eye level face pull instead and see if it feels better. The key to this is you need to make sure that your elbows don't go above your shoulders. You should be pinching the shoulder blades back, and we need to make sure that we have our glutes engaged and our core engaged so that we're maintaining a neutral posture in the core. But all the same geometries apply. Here you see a relationship, and when we get it to the position where it's at the very top of the motion, what you're going to see is that if we go the direction of the cable, that's the direction of the resistance, and we look at the starting position, we're seeing a very strong triangle of support that's right now being activated by the posterior chain. And the front is maintaining a neutral position as much as possible. I also want to make sure that I am keeping my sternum flat, relatively neutral, and I don't want my sternum raising as I'm externally rotating my arms, because I want to learn to control the shoulder joint separate from the rib cage. Now this is the opposing movement. I call this the hammer or doko. It's from martial art I studied. Here, again, you're going to see all the right foundations of support, but what's happening is my elbow stays in line with my shoulder, doesn't go higher than that. I am allowing the cable to pull my arm back into external rotation, and then I am going through internal rotation and extension at the arm. So This is kind of a throwing or hand axe kind of motion. I believe this is evolutionarily incentivized for humans. And you can see that there's side flexion throughout the whole motion, even though the hips are staying relatively stable in this case. And that even though I am moving all those things, there is a strong center around the thoracic spine and a column of support that is holding us through the spine from pretty much the middle of the thoracic all the way down through the tailbone and rear heel. Arm external rotation with extension. So this isn't really a fly and this isn't really external rotation. It's a little bit of both with tricep extension thrown in. The reason is because when we go back and look in video 4 at the arm lines, this is how the lines move through the arm. So we're trying to exercise the arm in synergistic unity, meaning that we're trying to use it the way it's put together, not the way the levers are put together, but the way the muscles are put together. Understand that if you have a history of shoulder issues, crossing your center line may initially be challenging, and you may find that doing things out to the side in an upward manner can be really painful. So instead, we want to maintain a relatively stable core. This is considered in the lateral medial programming days because the static resistance we're producing is isometrically against the force that's coming from the side. And we're learning to use the arm across the body in this way. And the body is learning to stabilize the arm in that function, in that lateral medial force. So these movements are normally put in with lateral medial days. And also it's important to remember that the scapula is not raising and lowering, but staying down in a neutral position throughout this. As I pull across my body, I'm then extending out into my elbow, and as I extend into my elbow, I'm rotating my thumb up. So this is the opposite. This is arm internal rotation with flexion. This kind of starts as a bicep curl. And if I can cross my center line again, I do. But the first thing I do is kind of pull my elbow toward my ribs. Then I start an inward rotation and curl type motion. Once I get it past a neutral position, I start pushing it across my body. This actually engages the chest and pec and can be really beneficial. All of these movements are vectored, so sometimes you'll do them in a high anchor position, a middle anchor, and a low anchor. And you can see these triangles continue to occur and that we are resisting energy from the side. So this lateral medial energy. So this is considered a lateral medial movement. And I want the shoulder again to stay down. If you're looking at this quadrant view, you can see I'm not raising and lowering my shoulder, and my hand does not go above my shoulder joint. And then we have the Yanda sit-up. Now normally I don't think sit-ups are a great thing, but the way the Yanda sit-up is designed, it's designed to teach you how to get into and maintain a neutral lumbar position while allowing your thoracic to round and go into extension. This strengthens the relative position between the hips and the rib cage, even though the head's moving. And you'll see as I do this that we're following certain lines of structural support and that we're really hinging almost entirely from the hips, because when you do a sit-up, your hip flexors are involved. So this has to do with strengthening the hip flexors so that they can be called on to engage and disengage. A lot of the time when the hip flexors are tight, it's because they're in a kind of a state of spasm. So strengthening the hip flexors through range of motion can actually really help with getting them to fire properly in unison with the rest of the core. The problem is when the core is not working and the hip flexors are picking up all the extra work and they go rogue. So we want to integrate the hip flexors and the TVA and the rectus abdominis and the obliques so that they learn to work synergistically, not separately. So this sit-up, it's really key to understand that the pelvis tucks first, the lumbar is flat on the ground, and I'm not throwing my head, I am pulling myself up with my core maintaining a neutral flat back position as I lower. All of these videos are available on my YouTube channel. You can go and look at them individually on your own. I'll actually have them all loaded into a playlist that you can probably access in the description below. So if you want to review them closer, and each one of them has their own narrations. I'm just doing the narrations now. You can see this is a pretty simple movement, but it's all about really working on regulating the pelvic rib cage position and getting the core to work in unison to stabilize that, and really learning to resist on the eccentric movement. So now we're going to look at core processes. One thing that's key in this is posture and movement assessment. So when we look at posture and movement assessment, it's important to understand that every single time we see somebody, we're going to be assessing them. That is going to happen consistently. So assessment starts from the first moment you lay eyes on a person, looking at their posture first, then gait. From there, you can work on movement-specific assessment, meaning you can pick one of the core movements, practice it, and see where the issues are. It is best to use core movements in the system. So you are looking for places the body moves too much or too little. That's part of that interdependence model and understanding that. And you're looking for postural asymmetry. Where are there asymmetries? This is a former client of mine. You can see here, this was the early picture. Later on, there was significantly better core control and positioning. And, well, actually, sorry. So what's interesting about this is that you can see here he's off center. He's to one side. Here he's more on center, but more off in the shoulders and chest. And the thing is, posture isn't static. It actually changes from day to day with different stimuli. So even these kinds of assessment tools like this, they're great, but you have to understand that from day to day, people's structures change. And even within a session, you can create a significant shift in posture. The more frequently you're able to affect that shift, the more permanent it will become. But understanding that there's a window of plasticity, not only for the tissue, but for the neurons to learn new mechanics, and that we want to have people going into that window often in order for those new mechanics to become the norm. But if all of a sudden a person's not getting consistent stimuli, they're going to go back to whatever the dominant pathway is in their neurology, and that most likely is a process of dysfunction. So these assessments should be done at the beginning of every session, and I also do them at the end. Also ask, how have you been feeling? Where are you sore from the last session? Looking for lifestyle clues that may give you more information, taking into account stress on the nervous system that can affect the tonic muscle tension. That's a big one. If people are in a highly stressed state, those tonic muscles kick on harder and the phasic ones turn off. Things get worse the more fatigued people get physically, mentally, and emotionally. So, managing those factors is part of your job as a coach or part of your job as an athlete for yourself. So this is a regular assessment questionnaire that I will do daily or weekly with clients. I'm not going to go over all of these, but this is my version of a questionnaire I stole from an Olympic lifting coach. I believe he was one of the first people to start using it. And what this does is it gives us an idea of where the person's nervous system and recovery level are at. Because pain, discomfort, tension, all of those things are neurological. We process them all neurologically. So how's your mood? Your mood can be affected by overtraining. How's your sleep quality? Your sleep quality can be affected by overtraining, or it can be a factor in overtraining. So if you're getting poor sleep, you're more likely to be overtraining. If you're overtraining, you're more likely to get poor sleep. How is your energy level? Like, how motivated is the client? Do they feel like they have energy? How has their diet been? This gives us an idea of what's going into their body. Alcohol does play a role in recovery. As I like to tell people, I'm not a cop and I'm not a priest. I don't care. It's not a judgment. It's about figuring out what factors are involved. How is your muscle soreness? How is your pain level? So soreness and pain are different. And there's an important thing about asking these questions is seeing if clients can even distinguish the difference and trying to help them learn the difference. And then how's your freedom of movement? So say the person's soreness is high, but their pain level is low and they feel a little stiff. Well, that means they had a good workout. Let's say their soreness level is low, their pain level is high, and they're feeling really stiff. Well, that could mean a couple of different things. And so it's about kind of learning how to read the tea leaves. It's not about each individual question. It's about the picture that they paint for the person all together. You have to get a sense of this. So when it comes to addressing issues or like dysfunctions, either in posture or gait or mechanics, we want to train the whole movement as much as possible. So we want to be training whole large-scale movements. We're going to say, 80% of the time should be the goal. As issues arise, and they will, we want to assess, test, and address and reintegrate those affected areas, understanding that the issue can span the whole system, and we will only see it in one or two places. Now, when you start seeing brand new clients, the first thing you're going to do is start looking for where are the imbalances that are going to be a problem in the training process, and you want to correct those first while you begin teaching the core movements. And then as they're learning the core movements, you're doing corrective work that's setting them up for success. And then once those core issues are resolved, you put them on the program that we're going to define here. And then when issues arise, you just quickly address them and get them back on the core system. So the way that we do this is we use movement and posture to assess, and then we devise, if we see an issue, we devise an experiment, we do the experiment, and then reassess. So, I see that there's an issue somewhere. I think, okay, maybe that's because the rectus femoris is tight. Maybe it's the hip flexors. So we roll out the rectus femoris and we stretch it, and then we look at the whole movement again, and if the movement looks better, congratulations, we resolved it. It's something that we're going to keep an eye on. If it happens consistently, we assign that as homework for a few weeks until it resolves itself. If what I thought was going to happen didn't happen, I continue assessing until I find the source of the issue. And you may find that I fixed the rectus femoris, but now the upper left shoulder's out. So now I'm going to check on the shoulder, and then I fix that, and then I notice something else moves. If you follow these chains enough, you're eventually going to find that there is a core issue that all of a sudden allows everything to be in balance. I refer to this as peeling the onion, because there's layers to how dysfunctions develop in the body. And so a lot of the time, when you're first starting out doing this, you'll address something and then something new will happen. And you'll be like, I don't understand. And the reality is that these things, if we go all the way back to the cumulative injury cycle and the Yanda approach, these things developed in relationship to each other. So what's happening is you're pulling on the end of the first thread and it's making all the other connections obvious. So if you follow those connections, eventually you're going to get to the source. So it isn't that the person needs to continue to correct all three steps. We just have to establish where the source is and then address that specifically. And once you do that, you should be good. And then it's not do 18 things. It's we did 18 things to figure out the 3 things you need to do. Keep doing those 3 things. And then check in regularly to see if those other issues stay resolved. So areas that you want to assess when I talk about working up and down the chain is we start at the global system level. If we see an issue in ranges of motion, proper joint control, proper muscle activation, an order of operation, proper rhythm and timing of movements, and proper global coordination of all systems, wherever the problem occurs, then let's say it's in the arm, the elbow or the wrist isn't moving properly. Well, then we're going to look at the whole arm first. that's multiple joints, and try to address it at that level. If we can't resolve it at that level, then we're going to go down to single joints. Maybe it's just the elbow. Well, let's look at all the muscles that feed into the elbow and affect the elbow, and then work our way back up the chain again until we fully reintegrated it here. So we start at the top, work our way all the way down, and then work our way all the way back up with reintegration, using the release it, mobilize it, activated method at each layer, like I said. So we're going to use tool-assisted or manual myofascial release to prep the affected area and areas above and below. So we don't just go where the discomfort or dysfunction is, we still look at the areas above and below. We use movement to lengthen the tissue in the specific area and send new neural mapping to the nervous system. So maybe this is a controlled articular rotation. Maybe this is a single joint activation. Maybe this is just practicing the movement without resistance to integrate it into the body. Then we activate it. We use an exercise like resistance training to activate the movement, control it relative to the whole movement, and reintegrate it. So how can I isolate the mechanic that I'm looking for, apply the pressure and resistance that I need, and see if the person can now use the ABCs on that specific area. Once the answer is yes, then we say, great, let's go back to the original movement, the large core movement, and integrate that subset back in. Over time, you do this consistently, and what you wind up with is, people feel like they're chasing problems around the body, but the reality is this is just how the body is. The body's not stably in space. It's always adapting, it's always reacting. So by always reacting with it to keep it in balance and as close to ideal structure as possible, the body's actually going to become more adaptive. And so you can just address the issue, it goes away, it reintegrates, and you continue on. And over time, you'll start with areas that take 6, 8, 12 weeks to fix. And then 9 months later, a thing pops up, you press a ball on it, you kind of stretch it out, you go back and do the movement, it's reintegrated, it's fine, because there's a much higher degree of adaptability in the neurology and the tissue and even in the mind to absorb that new information. So we're going to talk about releasing things. We're going to use tool-based releases to manual release techniques and hydrate mobilized tissue. That little ball set to the side is one that I often recommend to clients. Or we can use cups, tools. If you're a massage or therapist or body worker, you can use that. Whatever works for you. Using pressure to encourage the brain to remap the affected area. Touch really, really helps. Through kinesthetic experience, you grow your awareness of the body and the sensations that you feel to better understand what it is your body is telling you. That's really, really, really important, is that you are consistently updating and reintegrating this new information into the nervous system. Next, we're going to mobilize. So in combination with the release technique, you want to follow up with a series of stretches and movements. These can be partner-assisted stretches. These could be yoga-based movements. These could be simple static stretches. I personally prefer things like dynamic stretching, loaded stretching, and controlled articular rotations, but I don't expect people to mimic exactly my tools. I'm simply giving you a process for you to integrate into your system and find what works best for you. This is going to help to increase glide and elasticity in the tissue and help with hydration and shock absorption in that particular area. The longer the tissue is, the more shock it can absorb and the more energy it can be loaded with. This reduces impact on joints as well as balances posture for overall better biomechanics. For example, if you have a short lateral line on one side, we would want to stretch that side out and activate the opposing side to shorten it. So I want to stretch the short stuff, activate the long stuff, back to that whole upper-lower cross-layered syndrome idea in the Yanda method, reviewed in video 4. So activate. Activating the muscles and the nervous system is key. Once the tissue has been reoriented and the nervous system and muscles need to fire under the new conditions to cement the new pattern. Skipping this step means that you'll never create new patterns in the long run, and you'll have to constantly be releasing and stretching, which is where people get stuck. They think that just because something's sore, they shouldn't move it, and that's just not true. Release it, stretch it, move it. Once we get new mechanics, we're going to get better hydration and nutrition and better motor mapping and better efficiency. So eventually we're not going to have to do all the releasing and stretching. The idea is to progress through the model, not constantly add to it. So that's why we want to integrate. Integration is the process of bringing all the elements into balance. Posture, gait, function, and dynamics come together in everyday activities. Integration of all levels increases performance and expands the loci of movement for decreased risk of injury. So now we want to get into how do we put all this crap together over the long term? 4-phase training model. So in phase 1, we want to restore relative balance to the system. So assess where the major issues are, start addressing them while teaching the basic core movements. Then we want to get into using the core movements to strengthen the system. Then we want to start increasing volume, which is going to fatigue the system and challenge coordination and control. And then once we've established a really strong foundation after 9 months to 12 months of training, we can then start to integrate into skill-specific movements. But we're taking a very long view here. So on a daily level, we're going to alternate between anterior, posterior, lateral, medial, and rotation days. Loaded and vectored movements in each session for each one of these. Secondary movements are based on observations of the primary movements, and we work to mobilize, strengthen, and integrate inefficient areas of those movements. So weekly, you have 2 options. Option A would be a 1-2-3 day, where we would do anterior, posterior day, lateral, medial day, rotation day. Rep ranges would be between 6 and 8, or 8 to 12, depending on whether you're looking at more strength or more hypertrophy. Rest between 30 to 90 seconds, whatever gets you into that zone 2 heart rate zone. And we're looking at a total of between 20 and 40 sets for a total workout. 30 minutes of zone 2 cardio per session, or on in-between days would be recommended also to make sure that we're getting healthy. Again, this idea of moderate activity. Option B is the one that I and many of my clients do, which is 6 days a week. So days 1 and 4 are anterior, posterior, days 2 and 5, lateral, medial, days 3 and 6, rotational days with some support work. The rep ranges can be 6 to 8 on days 1 through 3 because it's going to be a heavier load day, and then 8 to 12 on days 4 through 6 because we're going to have a higher metabolic stimulus and volume day. Rests should be between 30 and 90 seconds, and again, everything's pretty much the same. So a cycle, currently I run 10-week cycles, 9 weeks on with 1 week off, and I increase sets every 3 weeks. So weeks 1 through 3, 3 sets, weeks 4 through 6, 4 sets, weeks 7 through 9, 5 sets. And then in cycle 1, we do inside-outside loading, and then a bit of both on week 3. On cycle 2, we do double load on A day, and then inside-outside on B day. Cycle 3, we do uneven load on A day, and then inside-outside on B day. And then in cycle 4, we do double loading on A day and uneven loading on B day. There is a microcycle built into the 10 weeks. It runs 3-week microcycles. So weeks 1, 4, and 7 is outside load dominant and high anchor. Weeks 2, 5, and 8 are inside load dominant and middle anchor. Weeks 3, 6, and 9 are half of the sets are outside load, half of the sets are inside load, and we do low anchor vectored work. And then week 10 is active recovery with soft tissue mobilization and possibly zone 2 cardio, just depending on their level of overtraining. This gives the body time to recover. Tendons can catch up. Nervous system can fully recover. And ultimately, what that's going to bring us to is understanding that we're also going to be working soft tissue work into weeks 1 through 3 and week 10. So every 10 weeks, there's 4 weeks of soft tissue work built in. And then in weeks 4 through 6 and 7 through 9, the soft tissue work is as needed. So when you put all of this together, you get a formulaic but adaptive approach. Basically, we're creating a framework with flexibility. It's systematic but individualized. It is skill-based, it is practice-based, and it's extremely dynamic. And as a result, you're going to gain muscle, your metabolism is going to increase, your cardiovascular health is going to be excellent, and you're going to be practicing skills that are directly linked to health, wellness, and longevity. So I hope this has been helpful. If you have any questions, leave them in the comments section below. Check the description for extra information on different topics that are in this video. And please feel free to make suggestions about future content, things that you'd like to know more about, and things that I can help flesh out for anyone that would like to utilize this system. Thank you so much, and feel free to follow me on Instagram. Right now, I'll have it linked in the description. And other than that, if you would like to know more or you would like to work with me in person or online, feel free to contact me through my social media or my email, which will be listed in the description. Thank you again for watching, and hopefully we'll continue to have an ongoing discussion about how to improve this methodology. I'm curious to know what other people think that have experience in this field. Thank you.